So, Eamon, I looked in the archive when we were doing up the Greg Lynch article over the weekend, and between 2010 and 2020, I think we had 100 articles in the Sunday World about Greg Lynch and almost nothing over the last few years. But obviously, he's come on to the radar again due to this, the most recent hack into the ghosted encrypted network, but still a very well-known name in Irish gangland history.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly looks like he learned his lesson in terms of keeping his head down, staying out of trouble. The fact that he's been caught up in this multinational investigation, that seemed to have a kind of a focus on Ireland and Australia as the two main areas where these ghost encrypted phones are being used. And it looks like he's become a significant player again. Now, he always was. I mean, I had a quick look at some of the stuff as well, and you would have written about him. I think I wrote about him a couple of times. And we'd have grown up in Oliver Bond and still very much believed to have been controlling, certainly up to a couple of years ago, at the very least anyway, what was being described by some locals as, an open-air supermarket. And it was a quite lucrative area for drug dealers, and he would have grown up there at a time when Daniel Kinahan and Christy Kinahan Jr. were young men growing up, or young boys growing up, and you would have had James Quinn, who went on to become Daniel's kind of assassin or killer or muscle or enforcer, or whatever you want to put it, in Spain. And Fat Freddy would have been known to Greg Lynch as well. They would have all been part of the same group running together, so he would have been seen as part and parcel of that group, and certainly would have been, a key enough figure in the Kinahan, drugs business in Dublin around that time, 2010.
Yeah. I think he was, I suppose, in a way, sort of gangland royalty in the sense of his personal background. Like James Quinn, as you said, would have been his kind of one of his childhood friends, and they would have been sort of seen as a slightly younger generation than Daniel Kinahan, like just less than 10 years or whatever difference. And they were kind of the guys who were running around for them in Dublin. But Greg Lynch was so deeply connected in through his uncle, Gerard Hatchett Kavanagh. Gerard Hatchett Kavanagh was, until he was shot dead in Spain ultimately, he was one of the most significant drug dealers in the city. Very much associated with the Kinahans, though they did kind of have a separate network. And obviously, Hatchett Kavanagh's own family connections. He's a first cousin of Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, and he's also a first cousin of James Mulvey, a Birmingham drug dealer who was also serving, I think it's 23 years in prison. So they really were part of that tight network. And then obviously Bomber Kavanagh is connected into the Byrne family. So Greg Lynch would have been mentored in by his uncle, and would have had that Kinahan connection and would have had a doorstep in, I suppose. But even as a very young man, he ended up obviously in jail with a very serious conviction.
I think he was just 19 when he was caught with a stash, was it 400,000 of drugs? And he ended up getting, I think, was a 6 or 8 year sentence, something like that. Like you said, he was kind of born into it. I mean, Christy Kinahan Sr. would have been living in the Bond, for periods at that time, and would have known his family, other family members as well. So he would have been completely sort of trusted in that regard.
Yeah, and he did his time well, as they said, and kept his head down. And look, I suppose what happened with Greg Lynch is that he rose to the top. But then what we believe now is that he became victims of probably the Kinahan dark arts, I suppose. And infamously, I suppose, he managed to survive being shot in the face outside a pub in Cabra. And it was one of those attempted murders. That shooting sparked, such a wave of retaliations and fallouts, and that continued up until the conviction of Butler Devoy. That whole.
Yeah, when Derek Butler Devoy, I think he got a 15-year sentence. That was the whole madness escapade where he was seen waving a machine gun, and armed Gardaí went in, and at one point there was a hand grenade rolling around in the bathroom as they subdued him.
Yeah.
And I suppose Butler Devoy, his brother Mad Mickey, had been shot dead 2 years after Greg Lynch had been shot in the face in 2013. And that was kind of seen as being carried out in revenge for that. But some years later, I think as kind of the Kinahan Hutch feud was kind of getting into full swing, Lynch made it clear he wasn't taking sides, and it appears like he learnt the truth, that he had been the victim of pretty much a double cross, and that they think it was Fat Freddy who had kind of provided the animus, the motivation to have a go at Greg Lynch on the basis that he'd been involved with someone, and Fat Freddy was jealous of this particular relationship of some form or another. And so it was given the go-ahead by Kinahan, who was basically betraying like a childhood friend. So it just shows you where they weren't going to stop at anything in that regard. And Mad Mickey Devoy then was killed 2 years later, presumably by associates of Greg Lynch's, people. It was seen as a revenge. And I think then there was the reports at the time that there was €100,000 handed over to Bottler Devoy by way of compensation. That the mistake was made and no hard feelings, and that was in fact seized by the Criminal Assets Bureau before he could get out of Dodge.
Yeah, I mean, incredible events, and of course, one of the people that were suspected of shooting Michael Devoy, Mickey Devoy, was Jason Buddha Mullineux, was suspected of being the driver, and never convicted of it, never prosecuted, but Mullineux would ultimately be killed after being a suspect for attempting to shoot Bottler Devoy, a murder attempt that ended up with him killing Bottler Devoy's sister, Antoinette Corbally. So, I mean, it sparked a whole wave of things. In the meantime, even after Greg Lynch was shot, he remained close to the Kinahan network. Hatchet Kavanagh continued to be over in Spain, was regarded as kind of a key figure that, in fact, what is believed he was him, and along with Bomber and along with James Mulvey, they had their own kind of drug network, importation network. But as again, what we've been told is that Daniel Kinahan wanted to kind of separate Bomber out from those other two people, and then ultimately Hatchet Kavanagh would be shot dead in Spain in a kind of a similar dark art scenario, I suppose.
And then there was, I suppose, the preemptive strike then against Paul Kavanagh, who was shot dead in Dublin, Hatchet's brother, and again, uncle of Greg Lynch. So, yeah. I mean, I suppose the way it's been kind of framed, the narrative now is that this is very much young Daniel Kinahan sort of hardening up his control and taking, full reins over the drugs gang. And he wasn't, he wasn't ready to tolerate, I suppose, potential competitors in that regard. I think there was a murder of a Dutch Spanish or a Dutch South American figure who was shot dead. Again, that cleared the way for I think the Kinahan Cartel to really kind of get things going with people in South America and kind of move them up at an entirely different level. So I suppose these wave of killings came, even though some of them were at the time of the Kinahan Hutch feud, they were very much.
Well, they were a precursor, I suppose, to some of that fallout.
Yeah, but even, I suppose, I mean, Gary Hutch being, I suppose, the first murder of that, but it was, we know James Quinn was serving time in Spain for that killing. And he is suspected of some of these other events that happened in Spain before that. That was, very much Kinahan Jr. putting his grip on things.
Yeah, and what they say was that Daniel Kinahan wanted Bomber to kind of integrate Bomber's network into his, and that Daniel Kinahan at least certainly was putting out rumours about Hatchet Kavanagh. But the fallout didn't happen immediately after. If you remember Hatchet Kavanagh being shot, I think it was a Saturday night, and we were going to print nearly. That's one of the reasons I do remember it. But in the aftermath, there was, which is, I suppose, the usual talk when somebody is shot in somewhere like Spain about Russian mafias and all of this. And in part, that was put out by the Kinahan network. But ultimately, it appeared at least James Quinn had a role in that murder, at least set it up, and it's suspected that the two hitmen who were caught on camera at the time, very dramatic CCTV when you see it, of Hatchet Kavanagh trying to flee from a gunman in an Irish bar, and he's shot dead. That was all a kind of a Kinahan plot, and that it took a while for Greg Lynch and to sort of maybe disassociate himself from the Kinahans. But it did happen by the time of the feud. In the run up to in Trudeau's years, he continued to play a very key role in their network. But in the aftermath, he seems to have disassociated from the Kinahans, I suppose.
Yeah, well, he did have his own network, or sorry, not network, but he had his own connections with people directly in Spain.
Yeah.
And some of this would have come from Hatchet Kavanagh, who had been obviously based there, as you mentioned. And it's a completely, I suppose, separate network to the Kinahans, who I suppose to some extent are now above that, in a sense that they're just down, like they don't really have a street gang as such in Dublin, but they would still be working as brokers, in a sense that they're no longer sponsoring football teams, let's say.
Yeah.
They're just sticking to their banking work at the high level. They're in Dubai, presumably moving finance and drugs at a very high level, so that, all the way down to, people in Crumlin who consider themselves major players in the domestic scene are, they're quite a good bit down the ladder. And this is what the Ghost network kind of showed, is that all that business now is being conducted by separate gangs. Like we know, the family were mentioned, Greg Lynch's associates, his network were mentioned, and there was two other, a Wicklow-based gang and another Irish gang involved in selling the phones that have been identified. So I think was it something like 100, I think, phones are in Ireland and
Something
300
like
in
that.
Australia. So they're the main ones.
Yeah. I mean, so you see that exactly as you say. I mean, the Kinahans kind of specialise, I suppose, in these container ships and bringing drugs in that way. But you can see there are other ways that are brought in, and there are other criminal networks. Greg Lynch's gang continued to be a target for Cab in recent years. There was a number of raids in about 2018, all focusing on his network in the South Inner City, while he disassociated himself with the Kinahans, along with his other key pal, I suppose, Paul Rice, an armed robber who was very close to Hatchet Kavanagh. They were, if you remember, when the feud kicked off, they were always being named as key Kinahan gang members, but they played no role. They took no involvement. And you can see these other networks on this Ghost network, that there are other smuggling routes that are occurring in Ireland other than those sort of Kinahan big shipments that we have.
Well, we do know that, the so-called Mr. Big, is a separate network that, it's presumably connections with people like the Penguin, George Mitchell.
Yeah.
And there's some people you talk to, like when they do actually talk to you, like maybe retired senior security officials either in the UK or in Ireland, will actually say that they think that Mitchell was bigger than Kinahan. Like they certainly did when they were working.
Yeah.
And like the glimpses that we've got of his own encryption network, which Nicola did a great series of great stories on, the bunker in Germany, where they'd set up this whole kind of system and were trying to sell that to people. Like, so that we haven't seen that one getting broken yet, or does it even exist? So you do wonder, it comes down to the fact that there's just so much money in drugs. You're never not going to have somebody trying to sell it, because there's also huge demand as well.
There is huge demand, and that demand now, I think we had the guard speaking in the aftermath of this Ghost network, speaking about how things have been diversified really in gangland, that, where once you had a monster operator sort of hoovering up everything and really trying to take control of it from root and branch, you now have these other networks, and there is a vacuum, and instead of being filled by one major organisation, it's being filled with these diverse kind of players, I suppose.
Yeah, there's even stuff in the Dutch press recently talking about that the so-called pickers, the people who are experts in getting into the port area and taking the consignments out of maritime containers that have arrived in a load of bananas or concrete or whatever, that they're getting up to 40% of the deal.
Yeah.
So that's how important that role is. So why would you give up all your money if you're the guy who has all the contacts with the port police or the port officials or whatever, or somebody in an airline who's putting stuff through for you without checking it and all the rest? Now, why would you give up that such a valued kind of asset for nothing? Because and that's obviously why, there's such a markup that, the kilo for $900 in Peru is whatever it is here, retail 76,000, and, and it's each stage as it goes along. So I suppose what the Kinahans were clear that you could see what they were doing was trying to control each stage. And they were very successful at it. Like with the super cartel, that's how they were able to work.
Yeah.
And it worked very well until they all went for a wedding in 2017.
Yeah. It just shows you, and I suppose you see as well people like, Greg Lynch from from the start of his adulthood life has been involved in that drugs business, at both at a high and a low level. And, you know, that they are also they also have 20 something years of experience effectively at that stage. And that, you know, if there is suppliers out there, they know how to do their business really, you know.
When you think about it, I mean, he nearly he pretty much had his face blown off by the gunman outside a pub in Cabra at that time, and underwent extensive surgery as far as we know. But I remember, I think I was driving anyway when we photographed him about a year later at a funeral in Thomas Street, and you could see the kind of, I suppose, the basic injury was still there.
Yeah.
But that he had recovered. He was there. He was holding court to some extent. He was the main guy, and that was 11, 12 years ago now. At this stage, about 10 years ago when this happened. So I mean, you can certainly see how he's obviously been successful to stay out of the Hutch feud, considering how many people close to him have been killed. And that he's obviously got his own supply, but he's good at what he does. He's I guess a retailer to some extent. Yeah,
I mean, I did stories on him, and I actually saw him in court once, and he must have recognised I was a reporter anyway. And I he's a big, strong man, and he had some presence, but he just stared. He was sitting in court, and he just turned around and stared at me for about 20 minutes. And you know, when you're being stared at by somebody like that, if you know what I mean.
Turn your bad eye to him.
No, but you know what I mean? And so sometimes you see guys on maybe, you know, on Talbot Street or whatever acting tough, and you think but Greg Lynch, he looked the part, I have to say, not because of how he was dressed and all, but he had that kind of genuinely menacing presence, you know, and I'm sure he wasn't happy to be photographed at the time or have his court case reported on. But you can sometimes see the people, and they have that kind of.
If I remember correctly, I think wasn't there some attempts as well to lure some of our photographers, and we think it was actually people associated with Greg Lynch who were behind it that were suggesting where he might be, and Nothing fortunately happened, but it was certainly a kind of almost a counterintelligence operation against the Sunday world to some extent.
Yeah, so I mean, but anyway, the Ghost Network, you know, the Guards certainly hope to bring charges against a number of people. It'll be a kind of a novel reality in Irish courts, because although EncroChat has provided intelligence for drug busts to occur, typically the cases when they've come to court have relied on basically on, you know, drugs being seized. We have had other cases as well where phones have been hacked into, but the devices have been found in the presence of the person, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So this would be a slightly different case, I think, where or it may not be, because we don't know if the phones have been seized as well. But
I think what certainly Drew Harris has more or less said this, that it was going to be easier because it was such a small group of people that were using these. I mean, worldwide it was 1,000 messages a day, which in isn't not a lot.
No,
so it's very specific, and the fact that there's kind of whatever it was 100 phones, but you think maybe half of that are you know, it's half of that of how many people are actively using them. That there was a change of devices at least once.
Yeah.
So that it brings it down to a kind of a very small, manageable level that they'll be able to. It should be easier to fit that jigsaw together. So we are expecting to see more developments.
Yeah,
I mean, certainly the seizure of 16 million worth of drugs and cash and cryptocurrency, another 11 arrests is fairly significant in itself.
100% is very, and it will be providing interest. It'll be an interesting case, because if you see in the EncroChat in the UK how they've really managed to prosecute people, a lot of it has been through this. Although there's, you know, locating the devices in a certain area, a lot of the cases have been, you know, people taking pictures and sending them to their, chatting to other people on the encrypted network, and maybe sending pictures of their cat, or there's loads and loads of them. I mean, that's really what's undone them a lot, or saying, you know, happy birthday to you, and the police can then go and say,
oh, that's the date of birth.
Yeah. So there's been loads of those little cases, and it'll be interesting to see how they land in an Irish court. But it's certainly, you know, it's targeting some major gangland figures, and it's another great success for criminal investigators in this country and abroad.
Yeah, it's just from what I've read about it, like the Ghost Network with this triple encryption, but they're a standalone handset. So you apparently you were able to use them without any previous ID, without using personal information or an old phone number. So I presume this handset was delivered to you, and then you're up and running. So
yeah, and I think that's the vendors are actually also being targeted. So yeah, I mean it's and I think we have reports in one of the Australian papers of the guy who set it up making, I think it was 10 million. They're hoping to grab off.
The guy living at home with his parents. Super geek.
I know.
What's the point?
Doesn't pay to be a super geek, Eamon. Anyway, there'll be plenty of more podcasts on the Ghost Network, no doubt, Eamon.
I'd say there will be.
We'll all become experts. So thanks very much.
It was a pleasure.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.